Welcome to For the Love of Language. I'm EJ.
And I'm Stacy. Welcome, everybody. We've got a fun topic today.
We're going to talk about questions.
It's a really broad topic, but there's so much to say about the cognitive aspect of questions, how it informs learning and everything. There's so many directions we can go, EJ.
What makes a good question versus a bad question?
Yes, because there are such things as bad questions. I know that some people are like, there are no bad questions. There are bad questions. It just depends on the context, I think.
It absolutely does. So where should we start then?
Well, since we already kind of talked about it, maybe we should discuss good and bad questions first, since we've already teased the idea a little bit.
For sure. I think, so there's a few things that definitely make a question less than ideal. Now, there's still, when we say bad, that's a very prescriptive...
Oh, it's such a prescriptive thing.
Right, and as linguists, we generally like to be descriptivists, and we like to describe what's happening rather than prescribe, this is how you should do something.
Maybe we should rephrase it and say, what is a useful question?
Or a more effective question.
Yes.
Because you might have reasons to use some of these things that we're going to talk about in a negative way. So I just want to preface it with that.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're trying to ask a really effective question to actually learn something or find out about something, a couple things that you probably want to avoid are compound questions.
Yes.
Or leading questions.
Yes. Let's talk about what compound questions are, EJ.
Okay. Cool. So a compound question is when you combine multiple questions into one.
Yep.
So instead of just asking a single question, like, what's your name? You'd be asking, what's your name and how old are you and how did you get here?
Where you're using and other, what do they call them? I totally forgot all of a sudden.
Like conjunctions?
Conjunctions, yes. Using fun conjunctions to just make one big long idea, which is already really hard for processing. But when you add a question on top of that and you're asking multiple questions that are conjoined by conjunctions, good luck processing all of that.
Right. And the example that I gave was maybe a little bit flippant, but you'll actually hear legitimate compound questions all the time.
Yeah.
Like, what were you doing here and why?
Yeah.
Or, maybe asking someone to describe the artist and the genre of a CD.
Mm-hmm.
Those kind of things come up all the time.
Yes.
And if you're being asked that kind of question, it kind of puts you in this freeze mode of, well, what do I answer?
Yeah, what do you answer first? Because something interesting about the way that human brains process things is that we do tend to section things off, right? And we do the phrase that we use is parsing. I think we've used that on the podcast before. You parse, you break apart longer ideas into shorter chunks. And this is just something natural that humans do. And sometimes people, depending on your background, depending on your language, you can have different styles of chunking things out. And so someone who is generating the question might have one idea of I want them to answer this question first, so I'll put it first. But then the person responding to the question might be I processed the last thing first, so I'll answer the last question first and then the first question last.
Or if you're like me, sometimes someone asks a compound question and you answer one piece of it and forget what the rest of the question was.
There you go. Yeah, because you've only processed the first part of you heard the first question, your brain processes it, and then you just forget to even listen to the other half of the question.
Right.
Super common.
So it's much more effective to just ask one question, get the answer to that question, and then ask the next one.
Yeah.
So that's compound questions. I think we dove into that pretty thoroughly. So the other one that I mentioned was leading questions.
Yes, which I think people hear a lot about in like courtroom dramas of like, oh, don't ask the witness a leading question, like that rule that can be an objection kind of a thing.
Right, but if you've actually never looked into it, a lot of people don't actually know what a leading question is. So there's multiple ways to describe it. One of the ones that I've heard that's generally effective is you have open-ended questions. Those are the questions that generally start with the what, who, when, where, why, and how.
Our fun little WH questions, as we call them in English.
Right, but those very open question words that you're not assuming anything when you're asking the question. You're not providing any part of the potential answer. It's just an open question. Versus if you have a leading question, generally it might be a yes/no question. Those are generally leading questions. Or it might include presumptions and your own ideas as potential solutions in the question itself. I've seen people do this at work all the time. Like, oh, is this task taking longer than normal because XYZ? That is a leading question. And people do it to try and avoid, putting any blame or like maybe they don't want to be super direct to not be rude. But I hear that kind of question all the time.
Yeah. No, you're very right. Those ones can be really sneaky. And I think that's why people often like call them out in like courtroom dramas specifically, because with like a leading question, you are making certain assumptions and you're not allowing this sort of like free form thought process. You're directing their thoughts towards like your own biases or your own assumptions instead of keeping it like you said, open-ended. And in doing so, you can color the way that somebody responds to that. So you mentioned like having a yes no question, but then having like because in there, and that someone might initially want to say like yes or no, but then the because might color their answer and make them a little bit more hesitant to say one way or the other. Or it might not be a well-formed yes-no question. There might not be a yes-no answer, and you're kind of just putting ideas or putting in other assumptions in there and structuring it like a question for politeness sake. Because that is something that you see particularly in English a lot, is things will be phrased as a question only to sound polite, right?
Definitely.
Not necessarily to actually investigate what's going on, but just as a form of courtesy.
Definitely. I think something that keeps on coming to mind for me, have you played the game Clue?
Of course I have.
So you have the like, did Mr. Mustard kill Miss Scarlet in the living room with a candlestick?
Yes.
Kind of question. Which that's not an open-ended question.
Yeah, very specific, asking about very specific scenarios in which there's an answer or not.
And I might have like messed up the character's name in the game of Clue, but
I think you did just fine.
Well, thank you. But if you wanted to change that into non-leading questions or like open-ended questions, it would be who killed Miss Scarlet instead of did Mr. Mustard do it. It would be where was Miss Scarlet killed instead of was she killed in the living room. And you can break down each part of the question like that. Now, language is just inherently messy, and half of the time when we're talking, we're not planning out what we're saying ahead of time. Like you want to be a dynamic, active participant in a conversation. And so if you're just like thinking through in your head and planning what you're going to say instead of listening to the person that you're talking to, that's gonna make the conversation weird and show that you're not really being an active listener. And so because part of being an effective communicator involves being immediate and thinking on the fly, you sometimes are formulating questions as you're asking them. And I think that can make it more difficult to ask good questions.
Yes.
So something to do in that scenario would be add a pause. Like if you're not quite sure what you want to ask, you can pause for a minute. Say, I have a question. Let me formulate it. Like, you could even be super explicit about it, and that's not weird.
It's not weird. I don't think it's weird at all.
If you're just awkwardly silent, that might be weird.
That might be weird. But if you say, I have a question, take a second. Yeah, I think that's more than okay and polite. But I'm also the kind of person that's very explicit about everything that's going on in my head at any given second. But I think it's good advice for people who might have a little bit of like social anxiety of like, it's okay if you got to take a minute and you got to think about things. I've recently started teaching again, fun fact for the podcast. And whenever I ask a question to the class, I plan for pauses. I want them to take their time and think about things. And I'm not going to rush or push, because that time of processing a question, especially in another language, takes a hot second. And so I've got to be patient. They've got to be patient. Questions are a great way to instigate learning, but they do take time.
I want to dive into that a little bit, actually, like how we formulate questions differently in different languages.
Yes.
So we've talked in the past a little bit about how different languages have different syntax and different intonation, and different languages do formulate questions differently. So in English, we use both syntax and intonation in order to indicate a question. And by that, I mean you do switch the word order a little bit. You put the question word at the beginning of the sentence. If you have a question word, yes. If you have one. Or instead of saying Brian did his job, you change it and say, did Brian do his job? And so you'll flip the verb to come earlier.
Yes.
That's a syntactic change in English, but that doesn't happen in every language.
No.
And when I mentioned intonation, in English, intonation is different from tone in general, because tone is on a single word. To change meaning, intonation is
it's across the entire phrase or sentence.
Right. So in English, when you put the tone up at the end of a sentence, that's an example of intonation, and we do that to indicate questions.
Yes, but not every language does this. For example, in, I believe it's Japanese, Japanese has their question words at the very end of the sentence. So you might not know that someone's asking a question until they use the question word at the end to indicate that what I asked is a question.
Chinese does that. They add the word ma at the end of a sentence, and it will make it a question.
Yes, and some languages have, because we talked about intonation in English, but other languages can have just a specific question tone that you can add to something to make sure that it's a question. So it's usually, I think you can find them in some African tonal languages where, like, depending on where the question word is or something, there can be like a high tone or a low tone. And like, if it's a high tone, then that's how you know it's a question. But if it's a low tone, you know it's a statement or something like that. Don't quote me verbatim, but I have seen some languages that have specific tone on a word that will indicate question. So it's not necessarily across the entire phrasal structure. It's just on the one word.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And then there's also languages that use intonation but do it differently than English does. Because like I said, English, you come up at the end of a sentence to indicate a question.
Yeah.
In Russian, you come up on the part of the sentence that you're questioning, and then you come back down for the end of the sentence.
Oh, interesting. Can you give us an example? I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but I'm just curious because I don't think I've heard of that one before.
Like, well, even if you're doing it in что это такое? What is this?
Oh, gotcha.
You have that rise on the question word, or on whatever's being questioned in the sentence.
Yeah.
And then sometimes you'll come down. So it's just very different in that way from English. And so if you're going between the languages, you need to watch your intonation, because you can be really confusing if you're not looking for those changes.
Yeah. And thinking about it a little bit more, because French is kind of an interesting language in terms of how it handles things like stress and tonality and stuff. And in French, it really, there is more of a focus on the word itself rather than like the intonation of the sentence. So I remember a couple of times listening to some of my professors and being very confused because maybe I missed the kel at the beginning of the sentence, and because there wasn't an intonational rise at the end, I didn't necessarily know it was a question. So it can sometimes lead to cross-linguistic confusion when you're looking for some of those like clues that might not necessarily be there.
Right. And that can lead to miscommunications if you have someone learning your language who comes from a language that structures questions differently. So being aware of just there's different ways, there's ways we haven't even brought up that people can make questions differently, because there's no way we could bring up all of the potential examples for any of the things that we discuss.
I know there's so many ways in English alone to create a question, let alone all the other languages in the world, all like 4,000 of them or whatever, however many there are right now.
Right.
But I kind of want to just touch on like the uniqueness of questions, because questions are really what separates, and at least in my opinion, what separates other communication systems from human language. Because often in other animal communication systems, you get a lot of like declarative sentences of like back off, or this is mine, or sort of like an assertion of some point, or like a warning.
Right, you're imagining like a dog snarling at it.
Exactly.
Or the dog. You do kind of have a question in a way. There's this thing where dogs will like bow to another dog to try and initiate play. And if the other dog responds the same way, then they'll start playing. So it's sort of like a question.
It's sort of like a question. It is kind of like limited, and a lot of animals express it kind of differently, right? There's lots of ways that an animal can express its consent of some sort. But there is something particular about like human communication where we have not only found out how to like ask for consent about things like starting play or finding a mate, right? And we've kind of broadened it to asking about specific people, specific scenarios, specific places. We've been able to like gather all this other information that isn't always communicated, or might not be communicated in quite the same way that other animal communication systems do.
Right, and that can go into a very abstract level.
Yes.
My thing with that kind of statement, though, is like, do we fully understand animal communication? Like, there's no way for us to know that animals, maybe some animal somewhere is doing this and we just don't know about it, or we don't understand the way that they're communicating.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people say language is the thing that separates the humans from the beasts, but I don't know. I always find it such an intriguing statement because it's so impossible to prove.
It is. And big statements like that, I understand, are kind of like, they've got a little superiority to them of like, humans are better. And it's my thing with statements like that is just that like humans have been able to do so much with the communication system. Like, we might not understand how other animal societies function, but we do know that ours is incredibly intricate to the point where we have a hard time understanding our own communication systems and how they work in our brains. And not to simplify others, but like it has been a point of self-reflection that I find very fascinating, of like, we have been able to think about how we think about things.
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting point. On a different note, are there any other ways that questions can just go wrong, or any other tips as far as giving questions? And that was a good example of a compound question.
Yes. That is a good example. But yes, I have found through teaching, and maybe you have found something similar, that often rephrasing a question can be very useful. Sometimes, and because like we said, there's a certain spontaneity to speech production, and there's something beautiful in that, but there is something else to repetition. of maybe someone didn't understand exactly what you were trying to ask, but finding a creative way to restructure it and ask the same thing but slightly differently to make it maybe easier for processing, maybe, using different vocabulary that might be a little bit more accessible or relatable or familiar to someone based on their background. I've found that the repetition of questions can be hugely useful in a lot of different scenarios.
Definitely. And being able to change the way that you're speaking and rephrase things for the other participant in the conversation, I view that as a part of strategic competency of
Yeah.
being able to think from a different angle, try out different solutions. Because if something isn't working,
Yeah.
just saying it louder, repeating it verbatim is not going to help. Like, you really need to try differently, take a different angle.
Mm-hmm.
I think another situation when you'd want to do that actually is sometimes direct questions, depending on the culture, can come across as very harsh.
Yes, you're very correct. There are some questions that, like, depending on how you structure it, could be considered very rude.
Even like the very, very simple question, why did you do that? Like,
Yeah.
that sounds very accusatory
Yes.
in most contexts. Versus if you just say, oh, what is it that made you do that?
Yeah, or what was your thought process here?
It's much less accusatory than like, why do you do that? Now, the tone makes it worse, but even if you say it and like they're really like, why do you do that? It still
has this connotation. Yes. Yeah.
And like in Russian, it's much more culturally acceptable and appropriate to ask way more direct questions than I would ask in English.
Yeah.
Versus in English, in some ways, we try and beat around the bush a little bit and not be super direct when we're asking questions. But you still want to avoid leading questions and ask open questions. But sometimes couching it in a little bit of conversation or even adding like a so beforehand can make it seem less aggressive.
Yes. There's lots of other fun little filler words that you can kind of sprinkle in places. And if you use the right tonality, then someone will understand that you don't understand. And you can kind of embed a question within a not question.
And then we can just go through all sorts of layers of inception here.
How much question embedding, how much nuance can you layer into human language?
I'm just sure imagining my son just asking, but why? But why?
But why? Right? And in some cultures that would be like perfectly okay to ask, of just like, but why? But
there's
like
still a limit.
There's a limit. There's a limit. But yeah, you're super correct. At my work, one of the other teachers had a discussion with the students because the students thought that the question of where do you work or what do you do for work was very invasive. So there's also like topics of certain things, like what you can and cannot question, that are like culturally relative. Because like in a lot of South American and Latin American countries, you don't ask what somebody does for work for like right off the bat.
Right.
You might ask them like what their name is, but you don't really want to know what they do for work. On the flip side, in places like Korea and Japan, one of the very first things you might ask somebody is how old they are, which is not something you would usually do in the United States.
Right.
But it's because in like Japan and Korea, those kinds of questions are necessary for how you should address them. And like you need to restructure what language you use depending on how old they are and like what their social hierarchy is comparatively.
Or I've had people ask me who aren't from the US, like, how much did your house cost? Or how much money are you making? And in the US, those are kind of very taboo.
Yeah.
It's
very personal to ask about your money.
About that. And you can, still respond relatively gracefully without actually giving anything away by saying like, more than I would have liked.
Yes.
Or something along those lines.
Yeah.
But it can feel a little bit invasive if that's not a question that's acceptable in your culture, or it can also be contextual as well. Like I think you brought up asking specific questions at work and, not wanting to be asked about work in other places. Sometimes there's different contexts where different questions are appropriate.
Yeah.
Like some people don't want to talk about their personal lives in a work environment at all. And
Yes.
other people want to really get to know their coworkers.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of variability there.
Yeah, for like another example is one of my students asked who I was going to vote for. And in the year of our Lord 2024, boy, is that loaded. And so I immediately got like bright beet red because first of all, my classroom was very hot. And second of all, I was a little thrown because that's not a question that you expect all the time. But this is another thing that's really great. This is another good opportunity to take a pause. I took a pause and I was like, all right, so students, this is a great opportunity to learn about what questions are inappropriate to ask somebody and which ones might be a little bit sensitive. And so we discussed about, what kinds of questions might be sensitive. And they continued to ask, so teacher, who are you voting for? And I'm like, I'm not going to tell you because it's personal.
There's nothing you can gain from answering that question.
Right. I'm like, it's not worth going into. We're not gonna go there. It's almost in terms, and I'm watching EJ right now getting a little flustered on my behalf. Now imagine me in front of the class.
I'm trying to not laugh in the microphone.
But like it's almost equivalent to like, oh, how do you like to shape your pubic hair? Right? Like it's a very personal question that like I'm not gonna tell you.
It's not your business.
That's not your business. But in other places, in other countries, it's perfectly normal to have discussions about the local politics are like and all of these different things. And, and that one can shift from year to year, month to month, good God, day to day.
Well, there's that whole cliche thing of like, you don't go to someone's house and start conversation about politics or religion. It's just not a good idea.
Yeah. Yep. So we had to have that little discussion in class. But those questions are completely valid. I remember when I was like a teenager and I went to Morocco for the first time. I was very kind of hesitant because I didn't know what kinds of questions would be appropriate or not. Like as being a young girl from Utah, I had lots of questions about Islam, but I wasn't sure which ones would be considered appropriate or which ones I could ask. So I ended up not asking a whole lot of questions at all and doing my own research later. And, after developing a rapport, you can ask some of those more personal questions too. But it's also relative and it can be a really tricky thing to navigate. But I like being open and honest about like those moments of that's too personal can be very enlightening and very helpful for people. So if you like, to our audience, don't be afraid to say no to a question.
Absolutely. You set the boundaries of what you're willing to share across the board. That's not just with questions, but like you set the boundaries of who comes into your house. Like everything in life, you need to figure out where you stand and how you want to relate to other people.
But just be aware that it is a little bit different. Like even in the United States, it's a little bit different asking questions in Utah than it is in New York. That was something that I had to learn when I did my master's degree in New York. I would make phone calls and the question and answer system is very different.
Expand on that a little bit.
So first of all, sometimes in certain places in New York City specifically, you might get someone who answers the phone, and this is a real experience that happened to me. They answer the phone and just say, doctor's office. I don't know which, like, the name of the doctor. I didn't know if, like, I got the correct doctor, like, the right type of doctor. I just knew that someone at a doctor's office picked up the phone. And so that initially got me a little flustered. Additionally, in Utah, there is a certain, like, kind of polite banter that you have of like, oh, how you doing? How's it going? What can I do for you today? In New York, that doesn't always happen. In fact, most of the time it doesn't. A lot of the times they'll just sit there and wait for you to ask whatever question you want to ask. So I was like, when I was put on the phones, people were very like, they were enamored. They were like, oh, you're so polite on the phone. And I'm like, it's just because that's what you do over here. But other like native New Yorkers, they will 100% sit there and wait for you to ask them whatever question. And it had better be very direct. So you can't say, so I was thinking about this and I was wondering maybe if you could tell me about what I could do in order for my schedule to be like this. Like that's far too long and complicated. You can ask, is the class on Saturday? And you will get a yes or no answer. But all of that hemming and hawing and kind of dancing around and explaining your thought process is not really tolerated over there. And well, it's tolerated, but like, they're not going to indulge you and be like, oh yeah, sure, no, I 100% understand. You know, there's much less back and forth in terms of questions. It's far more direct.
Well, I think that goes into a full topic as well of like what's considered polite and helpful in some places could be considered superficial banter in another that people just don't want to waste their time on.
Yeah, exactly.
And so knowing when to engage in what type of conversation, and you know, sometimes you want to talk to somebody and the other people aren't really in the mood to chat.
Yeah.
Like sometimes, you know, recognize that difference and just walk away, right?
Yeah. And so like in New York, a phone call, not the place for chit chat. You get on the phone, you get off the phone, that's it. If you want to have a like discussion with somebody, you better talk to them in person. You better like walk down to the office and like have be ready to like sit down and make some chit chat, you know?
And you're talking about like offices and like professional locales. If you want to just like call up a friend to chat, obviously that's different.
And there's certain levels of familiarity that, you know, where more things are allowed than others, right? Like I can ask you certain questions that I wouldn't ask other people because we've just known each other for so long. So there's a million different levels. I pity any alien that decides to come down to Earth and try to figure out what the hell is going on here, because good God, we don't even know sometimes. All the different layers and nuances to everything.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I kind of wish that I could be in the Olympic Village right now with like all of the athletes from literally all over the world. And
it's so beautiful, EJ.
It's true. Like it's really amazing what's happening. And it's crazy that like sports have been able to do that to an extent that most other avenues have not.
Yeah.
But just like the most important thing always is having a group that wants to communicate and that's willing to assume the best about others' efforts.
Yes.
And just that can go a long way, because even if you mess up and ask a stupid question, you can always move on as long as you react properly to whatever response you get. You can always rephrase it. You can always come back to it, as long as you're not having people get totally offended, which hopefully isn't going to happen if all parties are just assuming the best and doing what they can to communicate.
Yeah, I think this ties back very nicely to our last episode, the episode that y'all hopefully listened to before this one about Darmok, from the Star Trek episode of, you know, when people come from such completely different understandings and backgrounds, and there is just like a huge ocean of like misunderstanding. What really brings people together is that willingness to figure it out, that like dedication to, I don't understand, you don't understand, but we can work together to figure out what needs to happen. And as long as there's that cooperative spirit, lots of cool things can happen. Like, I don't know, the entirety of human civilization.
Right? I feel like we end on this note in a lot of our episodes.
We do.
But it's a good note, and it's true. So
keep it in mind, friends. It's good for you.
And ask good, direct, open questions.
Yeah. Be curious. Be curious about the world around you, and let your questions take you all sorts of fun places.
Or go out of your way to ask compound and leading questions and see what happens.
If you're determined to instigate miscommunication, by all means. Some people are very interested in that.
Or just to run your own personal experiment. It's all good.
There you go. Why
not? All right. Well, I think that's it for us today on the subject of questions. Mm-hmm. But feel free to ask us questions.
Yes, please. This is a great time for you to shoot back some thoughts and feelings to us about life, the universe, and everything.
Yes. So reach out to us at For the Love of Language on Instagram. We love hearing from you and hope you're having a fantastic day. Bye.
Bye.